Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy-Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now, and will be easier to solve while rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Before we go too much further, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to ask you for some support. If you'd like to support Sleepy-Time Tales, to help me to keep it ad-free and going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, please consider supporting it on Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is a monthly system of support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can get you fun bonuses based on your contributions. From as little as $2 a month, you get weekly access to early release on the main episodes, so that you get your fresh sleep aid on a Wednesday instead of a Sunday. And $5 a month gets you weekly bonus minisodes, special edits, and a monthly megasode, which is all of the previous month's releases in one big listen. But if monthly seems a big ask, you can make once-off tips through the tip jar on the website. I've got some basic merchandise up on a TeePublic store, which you can reach through the show notes or on the website as well. You can take advantage of our new partnership with SleepPhones, headphones designed specifically to help you sleep, rather than poking your ears like earbuds do or take up too much space and don't let you lie properly like your full-size headphone. But another way to help the show, maybe even a better way to help the show, is to just tell people about it. If you know someone who struggles to sleep, who will find benefits from listening to Sleepy-Time Tales, just tell them about it. If you do so on social media, please make sure to tag me in at Sleepy-Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter, so that I can see and I can thank you. And of course, I'd just like to shout out the music, which is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. Their music is available on their website at loyaltyfreakmusic.com and is well worth checking out. Thank you for taking the time. Let's get back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy-Time Tales? What is it for? What is this strange idea, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, mind spinning and emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepy-Time Tales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or maybe some kind of background noise, or even simply company. That's why I make these episodes quite long, so that I'm here for you, without any pressure of the end coming. Now, as far as I know, there are a couple of different ways to engage with the show. The primary idea is that it gives you something to focus on, a story or an event that lets you keep your mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxieties, to help you to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep. But maybe you need something a bit different. Maybe you just need some kind of background noise. Some people like the sound of the ocean, or the wind in the trees, or maybe just some boring dude droning on. But the important thing is that you don't try to force the sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the thread of the story and allow sleep to come for you naturally. Now, obviously, I'm hoping you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but don't feel pressurized. If this is your first night, it probably won't work for you. Maybe it'll take a few nights for you to get used to listening to my voice. Maybe my accent is strange for you. Maybe one episode just isn't long enough. Or maybe your problem isn't so much going to sleep. Maybe you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night. What I recommend, because it's what works for me, is to let the podcast run all night. Download a whole bunch of episodes in your podcast player of choice. Make sure it's enough to play through the whole night. Put them in a playlist and let them play. That way, when you wake up and it's still running and I'm still talking to you, you can just pop your earbuds back in and allow yourself to go straight back to sleep. You can even do the same thing if you find yourself waking up just before the alarm, 60 minutes or even 30 minutes. I recommend the same thing, and there's something about allowing yourself complete relaxation right before the alarm that's satisfying on a whole new level. But as you're listening, whether it's early in the evening, middle of the night, just too early in the morning, it's very important that you try to relax. If you're new to the show, this may seem strange to you, so just give it a chance. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. And we return this week to On Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. It may be objected that the principle of selection has been reduced to methodical practice for scarcely more than 3/4 of a century. It has certainly been more attended to of late years, and many treatises have been published on the subject. And the result, I may add, has been, in a corresponding degree, rapid and important. But it is very far from true that the principle is a modern discovery. I could give several references to the full acknowledgement of the importance of the principle in works of high antiquity. In rude and barbarous periods of English history, choice animals were often imported, and laws were passed to prevent their exportation. The destruction of horses under a certain size was ordered, and this may be compared to the roguing of plants by nurserymen. The principle of selection I find distinctly given in an ancient Chinese encyclopedia. Explicit rules are laid down by some of the Roman classical writers. From passages in Genesis, it is clear that the color of domestic animals was at that early period attended to. People sometimes crossed their dogs with wild canine animals to improve the breed, and they formerly did so, as attested by passages in Pliny. People in South Africa match their draft cattle by color, as do some of the Eskimo in their teams of dogs. Livingstone shows how much good domestic breeds are valued by the Africans of the interior of the continent, who have not associated with Europeans. Some of these facts do not show actual selection, but they show that the breeding of domestic animals was carefully attended to in ancient times, and is now attended to by everybody. It would indeed have been a strange fact, had attention not been paid to breeding, for the inheritance of good and bad qualities is so obvious. At the present time, eminent breeders try by methodical selection, with a distinct object in view, to make a new strain or subbreed, superior to anything existing in the country. But for our purpose, a kind of selection which may be called unconscious, and which results from everyone trying to possess and breed from the best individual animals, is more important. Thus, a man who intends keeping pointers naturally tries to get as many good dogs as he can, and afterwards breeds from his own best dogs. but he has no wish or expectation of permanently altering the breed. Nevertheless, I cannot doubt that this process, continued during centuries, would improve and modify any breed, in the same way as Bakewell, Collins, etc., by this very same process, only carried on more methodically, did greatly modify, even during their own lifetimes, the forms and qualities of their cattle. Slow and insensible changes of this kind could never be recognized unless actual measurements or careful drawings of the breeds in question had been made long ago, which might serve for comparison. In some cases, however, unchanged, or but little changed, individuals of the same breed may be found in less civilized districts, where the breed has been less improved. There is reason to believe that the King Charles Spaniel has been unconsciously modified to a large extent since the time of that monarch. Some highly competent authorities are convinced that the setter is directly derived from the Spaniel, and has probably been slowly altered from it. It is known that the English pointer has been greatly changed within the last century, and in this case the change has, it is believed, been chiefly affected by crosses with the foxhound. But what concerns us is that the change has been effected unconsciously and gradually, and yet so effectually, that although the old Spanish pointer certainly came from Spain, Mr. Borrow has not seen, as I am informed by him, any native dog in Spain like our pointer. By a similar process of selection and by careful training, the whole body of English racehorses have come to surpass in fleetness and size the parent Arab stock, so that the latter, by the regulations for the Goodwood races, are favoured in the weights they carry. Lord Spencer and others have shown how the cattle of England have increased in weight and in early maturity compared with the stock formerly kept in this country. By comparing the accounts given in the old pigeon treatises of carriers and tumblers with these breeds as now existing in Britain, India, and Persia, we can, I think, clearly trace the stages through which they have insensibly passed, and come to differ so greatly from the rock pigeon. Ewart gives an excellent illustration of the effects of a course of selection, which may be considered as unconsciously followed, insofar that the breeders could never have expected, or even have wished, to have produced the result which ensued, namely the production of two distinct strains. The two flocks of Leicester sheep kept by Mr. Buckley and Mr. Burgess, as Mr. Ewart remarks, have been purely bred from the original stock of Mr. Bakewell for upwards of 50 years. There is not a suspicion existing in the mind of anyone at all acquainted with the subject that the owner of either of them has deviated in any one instance from the pure blood of Mr. Bakewell's flock. And yet the difference between the sheep possessed by these two gentlemen is so great that they have the appearance of being quite different varieties. If there exist some who have never thought to think of inherited character of the offspring of their domestic animals, yet any one animal, particularly useful to them for any special purpose, would be carefully preserved during famines and other accidents, and such choice animals would thus generally leave more offspring than the inferior ones, so that in this case there would be a kind of unconscious selection going on. In plants, the same gradual process of improvement through the occasional preservation of the best individuals, whether or not sufficiently distinct to be ranked at their first appearance as distinct varieties, and whether or not two or more species or races have become blended together by crossing, may plainly be recognized in the increased size and beauty which we now see in the varieties of the heartsease, rose, pelargonium, dahlia, and other plants, when compared with the older varieties, or with their parent stocks. No one would ever expect to get a first-rate heartsease or dahlia from the seed of a wild plant. No one would expect to raise a first-rate melting pear from the seed of a wild pear, though he might succeed from a poor seedling growing wild, if it had come from a garden stock. The pear, though cultivated in classical times, appears from Pliny's description to have been a fruit of very inferior quality. I have seen great surprise expressed in the horticultural works at the wonderful skill of gardeners, in having produced such splendid results from such poor materials. But the art, I cannot doubt, has been simple, and as far as the final result is concerned, has been followed almost unconsciously. It has consisted in always cultivating the best-known variety, sowing its seeds, and, when a slightly better variety has chanced to appear, selecting it, and so onwards. But the gardeners of the classical period who cultivated the best pear they could procure never thought what splendid fruit we should eat, though we owe our excellent fruit, in some small degree, to their having naturally chosen and preserved the best varieties they could find anywhere. A large amount of change in our cultivated plants, thus slowly and unconsciously accumulated, explains, as I believe, the well-known fact that in a vast number of cases we cannot recognize, and therefore do not know, the wild parent stocks of the plants which have been cultivated longest in our flower and kitchen gardens. If it has taken centuries or thousands of years to improve or modify most of our plants up to their present standard of usefulness to man, we can understand how it is that neither Australia, the Cape of Good Hope, nor any other region has afforded us a single plant worth culture. It is not that these countries, so rich in species, do not by a strange chance possess the aboriginal stocks of any useful plants, but that the native plants have not been improved by continued selection up to a standard of perfection comparable with that given to the plants in countries anciently civilized. In regard to the domestic animals kept by uncivilized man, it should not be overlooked that they almost always have to struggle for their own food, at least during certain seasons. And in two countries, very differently circumstanced, individuals of the same species, having slightly different constitutions or structure, would often succeed better in the one country than in the other, and thus by a process of natural selection, as will hereafter be more fully explained, two subbreeds might be formed. This, perhaps, partly explains what has been remarked by some authors, namely that the varieties kept by people have more of the character of species than the varieties kept in civilized countries. On the view here given of the all-important part which selection by man has played, it becomes at once obvious how it is that our domestic races show adaptation in their structure or in their habits to man's wants or fancies. We can, I think, further understand the frequently abnormal character of our domestic races, and likewise their differences being so great in external characters and in relatively so slight in internal parts or organs. Man can hardly select, or only with much difficulty, any deviation of structure excepting such as is externally visible. And indeed he rarely cares for what is internal. He can never act by selection, excepting on variations which are first given to him in some slight degree by nature. No man would ever try to make a fantail till he saw a pigeon with a tail developed in some slight degree in an unusual manner, or a pouter till he saw a pigeon with a crop of somewhat unusual size. And the more abnormal or unusual any character was when it first appeared, the more likely it would be to catch his attention. But to use such an expression as trying to make a fantail is, I have no doubt, in most cases, utterly incorrect. The man who first selected a pigeon with a slightly larger tail never dreamed what the descendants of that pigeon would become through long continued, partly unconscious, and partly methodical selection. Perhaps the parent bird of all fantails had only 14 tail feathers somewhat expanded, like the present Java fantail, or like individuals of other and distinct breeds, in which as many as 17 tail feathers have been counted. Perhaps the first pouter pigeon did not inflate its crop much more than the turbot now does, a habit which is disregarded by all fanciers, as it is not one of the points of the breed. Nor let it be thought that some great deviation of structure would be necessary to catch the fancier's eye. He perceives extremely small differences, and it is in human nature to value any novelty, however slight, in one's own possession. Nor must the value which would be formerly be set on any slight differences in the individuals of the same species be judged of by the value which would now be set on them, after several breeds have once fairly been established. Many slight differences might, and indeed do now, arise amongst pigeons, which are rejected as faults or deviations from the standard of perfection of each breed. The common goose has not given rise to any marked varieties. Hence the Toulouse and the common breed, which differ only in colour, that most fleeting of characters, have largely been exhibited as distinct at other poultry shows. I think these views further explain what has sometimes been noticed, namely that we know nothing about the origin or history of any of our domestic breeds. But in fact, a breed, like a dialect of a language, can hardly be said to have had a definite origin. A man preserves and breeds from an individual with some slight deviation of structure, or takes more care than usual in matching his best animals, and thus improves them, and the improved individuals slowly spread in the immediate neighborhood. But as yet they will hardly have a distinct name, and from being only slightly valued, their history will be disregarded. When further improved by the same slow and gradual process, they will spread more widely, and will get recognized as something distinct and valuable, and will then probably first receive a provincial name. In semi-civilized countries with little free communication, the spreading and knowledge of any new subbreed will be a slow process. As soon as the points of value of the new subbreed are once fully acknowledged, the principle, as I have called it, of unconscious selection will always tend, perhaps more at one period than at another, as the breed rises or falls in fashion, perhaps more in one district than another, according to the state of civilization of the inhabitants, slowly to add to the characteristic features of the breed, whatever they may be. But the chance will be infinitely small of any record having been preserved of such slow, varying, and insensible changes. I must now say a few words on the circumstances, favourable, or the reverse, to man's power of selection. A high degree of variability is obviously favourable, as freely giving the materials for selection to work on. Not that mere individual differences are not amply sufficient, with extreme care, to allow of the accumulation of a large amount of modification in almost any desired direction. But as variations manifestly useful or pleasing to man appear only occasionally, the chance of their appearance will be much increased by a large number of individuals being kept. And hence this comes to be of the highest importance to success. On this principle, Marshall has remarked, with respect to the sheep of parts of Yorkshire, that as they generally belong to poor people and are mostly in small lots, they can never be improved. On the other hand, nurserymen, from raising large stocks of the same plants, are generally far more successful than amateurs in getting new and valuable varieties. The keeping of a large number of individuals of a species in any country requires that the species should be placed under favorable conditions of life, so as to breed freely in that country. When the individuals of any species are scanty, all the individuals, whatever their quality may be, will generally be allowed to breed, and this will effectually prevent selection. But probably the most important point of all is that the animal or plant should be so highly useful to man, or so much valued by him, that the closest attention should be paid to even the slightest deviation in the qualities or structure of each individual. Unless such attention be paid, nothing can be effected. I have seen it gravely remarked that it was most fortunate that the strawberry began to vary just when gardeners began to attend closely to this plant. No doubt the strawberry had always varied since it was cultivated, but the slight varieties had been neglected. As soon, however, as gardeners picked out individual plants with slightly larger, earlier or better fruit, and raised seedlings from them, and again picked out the best seedlings and bred from them, then there appeared, aided by some crossing with distinct species, those many admirable varieties of the strawberry, which have been raised during the last 30 or 40 years. In the case of animals with separate sexes, facility in preventing crosses is an important element of success in the formation of new races, at least in a country which is already stocked with other races. In this respect, enclosure of the land plays a part. Wandering people or inhabitants of open plains rarely possess more than one breed of the same species. Pigeons can be mated for life, and this is a great convenience to the fancier, for thus many races may be kept true, although mingled in the same aviary. And this circumstance must have been largely favoured the improvement and formation of new breeds. Pigeons, I may add, can be propagated in great numbers and at a very quick rate, and inferior birds may be freely rejected. On the other hand, cats from their nocturnal rambling habits cannot be matched, and although so much valued by women and children, we hardly ever see a distinct breed kept up. Such breeds as we do sometimes see are almost always imported from some other country, often from islands. Although I do not doubt that some domestic animals vary less than others, yet the rarity or absence of distinct breeds of the cat, the donkey, peacock, goose, etc., may be attributed in main part to selection not having been brought into play, in cats from the difficulty in pairing them, and donkeys from only a few being kept by poor people and little attention paid to their breeding, and peacocks from not being very easily reared and a large stock not kept, and geese from being valuable only for two purposes, food and feathers, and more especially from no pleasure having been felt in the display of distinct breeds. To sum up on the origin of our domestic races of animals and plants, I believe that the conditions of life, from their action on the reproductive system, are so far of the highest importance as causing variability. I do not believe that variability is an inherent and necessary contingency under all circumstances, with all organic beings, as some authors have thought. The effects of variability are modified by various degrees of inheritance and of reversion. Variability is governed by many unknown laws, more especially by that of correlation of growth. Something may be attributed to the direct action of the conditions of life. Something must be attributed to use and disuse. The final result is thus rendered infinitely complex. In some cases, I do not doubt that the intercrossing of species, aboriginally distinct, has played an important part in the origin of our domestic productions. When in any country several domestic breeds have once been established, their occasional intercrossing with the age of selection has no doubt largely aided in the formation of new sub-breeds. But the importance of the crossing of varieties has, I believe, been greatly exaggerated, both in regard to animals and to those plants which are propagated by seed. In plants which are temporarily propagated by cuttings, buds, etc., the importance of the crossing both of distinct species and of varieties is immense. For the cultivator here quite disregards the extreme variability both of hybrids and mongrels, and the frequent sterility of hybrids. But the cases of plants not propagated by seed are of little importance to us, for their endurance is only temporary. Over all these causes of change, I am convinced that the accumulative action of selection, whether applied methodically and more quickly, or unconsciously and more slowly, but more efficiently, is by far the predominant power. Chapter 2. Variation under Nature. Before applying the principles arrived at in the last chapter to organic beings in a state of nature, we must briefly discuss whether these latter are subject to any variation. To treat this subject at all properly, a long catalogue of dry facts should be given, but these I shall reserve for my future work. Nor shall I here discuss the various definitions which have been given of the term species. No one definition has as yet satisfied all naturalists, yet every naturalist knows vaguely what he means when he speaks of a species. Generally, the term includes the unknown element of a distinct act of creation. The term variety is almost equally difficult to define. But here, community of descent is almost universally implied, though it can rarely be proved. We have also what are called monstrosities, but these graduate into variety. By monstrosity, I presume is meant some considerable deviation of structure in one part, either injurious to or not useful to the species, and not generally propagated. Some authors use the term variation in a technical sense, as implying a modification directly due to the physical conditions of life, and variations in this sense are supposed not to be inherited. But who can say that the dwarfed condition of shells in the brackish waters of the Baltic, or dwarfed plants on alpine summits, or the thicker fur of an animal from far northwards, would not in some cases be inherited for at least some few generations? And in this case, I presume that the form would be called a variety. Again, we have many slight differences which may be called individual differences. Such are known frequently to appear in the offspring from the same parents, which may be presumed to have thus arisen from being frequently observed in the individuals of the same species inhabiting the same confined locality. No one supposes that all the individuals of the same species are cast in the very same mold. These individual differences are highly important for us, as they afford materials for natural selection to accumulate, in the same manner as man can accumulate in any given direction individual differences in his domesticated productions. These individual differences generally affect what naturalists consider unimportant parts, but I could show by a long catalogue of facts that parts which may be called important, whether viewed under a physiological or classificatory point of view, sometimes vary in the individuals of the same species. I am convinced that the most experienced naturalist would be surprised at the number of the cases of variability, even in important parts of structure, which he could collect on good authority, as I have collected during a course of years. It should be remembered that systematists are far from pleased at finding variability in important characters, and that there are not men who will laboriously examine internal and important organs and compare them in many specimens of the same species. I should never have expected that the branching of the main nerves close to the great central ganglion of an insect would have been variable in the same species. I should have expected that changes of this nature would be effected only by slow degrees. Yet quite recently, Mr. Lubbock has shown a degree of variability in these main nerves and coccus, which may almost be compared to the irregular branching of the stem of a tree. This philosophical naturalist, I may add, has also quite recently shown that the muscles in the larvae of certain insects are far from uniform. Authors sometimes argue in a circle when they state that important organs never vary, for these same authors practically rank that character as important, as some few naturalists have honestly confessed, which does not vary. And under this point of view, no instance of an important part varying will ever be found. But under any other point of view, many instances assuredly can be given. There is one point connected with individual differences, which seems to me extremely perplexing. I refer to these genera, which have sometimes been called protean or polymorphic, in which the species present an inordinate amount of variation, and hardly two naturalists can agree which forms to rank as species and which as varieties. We may instance rubus, rosa, and hieracium among plants, several genera of insects, and several genera of brachiopod shells. In most polymorphic genera, some of the species have fixed and definite characters. Genera which are polymorphic in one country seem to be, with some few exceptions, polymorphic in other countries. And, likewise, judging from brachiopod shells, at former periods of time. These facts seem to be very perplexing, for they seem to show that this kind of variability is independent of the conditions of life. I am inclined to suspect that we see in these polymorphic genera variations in points of structure which are of no service or disservice to the species, and which consequently have not been seized on and rendered definite by natural selection, as hereafter will be explained. And I think I'm going to leave it there for tonight. Had to edit out a fair amount of 19th century racism as I was reading, so it was an interesting and tiring one, unfortunately. But if you'd like to pick up where we've left off, you can find it, as always, on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.